Thank you. I certainly admire all of you getting up at dark 30 this morning to come out and hear this talk on the problem of evil. When I heard the topic that they set for me for this breakfast meeting, I thought, why in the world would anybody want to start his day at breakfast thinking about pain and suffering and evil in the world? But that's the topic that faces us this morning. Now, certainly the problem of evil is the most serious objection to the Christian faith in the existence of a loving and omnipotent God. Indeed, when I ponder the evil in the world, both in terms of human evil, of man's own inhumanity to man, as well as the natural evils of disasters, then I confess quite honestly that I find it hard to believe in the existence of God. Maybe some of you have felt the same way. Maybe we should just all become atheists. But that would be a pretty big step to take. I mean, how can we be sure that God does not exist? Maybe there's a reason why God permits all of the evil in the world. Maybe it somehow all fits into a sort of grand scheme of things that we can only dimly envision, if at all. How do we know? Well, as a Christian theist, I'm persuaded that the problem of evil, as great as it is, does not in the end constitute a disproof of the existence of God. On the contrary, in fact, I believe that Christian theism is man's last best hope for a solution to the problem of evil. Now, in order to explain why I feel this way, it will be helpful to make some distinctions to keep our thinking clear this morning. In the first place, we need to distinguish between what I call the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. The intellectual problem of evil concerns how to give a rational explanation of the coexistence of God and evil. The emotional problem of evil concerns how to dissolve people's emotional dislike of a God who would permit suffering. Now let's look first at the intellectual problem of evil. There are two versions of this problem, the logical version and the probabilistic version. According to the logical version of the problem of evil, it's logically impossible that God and evil could coexist. If God exists, then evil cannot exist. If evil exists, then God cannot exist. The two are logically incompatible. Now, since evil evidently exists, it follows, therefore, that God does not exist. But the problem with this argument is that there's no reason to think that God and evil are logically incompatible. After all, there's no explicit contradiction between them. So if the atheist means that there is an implicit contradiction between God and evil, then he must be assuming some sort of hidden premises which need to be brought to the light and which would serve to make this contradiction explicit. But the problem is that no philosopher has ever been able to demonstrate successfully what these premises are. And therefore, the logical version of the problem of evil has failed to demonstrate any inconsistency between the coexistence of God and evil. But more than that, we can actually prove, I think, that God and evil are logically consistent with each other. You see, the atheist presupposes that God cannot have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. But this assumption is simply not necessarily true. So long as it is even possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world, it follows that God and evil are logically consistent. And therefore, I'm very pleased to report this morning that the philosophical consensus today is that the logical version of the problem of evil has been dissolved. There is no inconsistency logically between God and evil. But we're obviously not out of the woods yet, because now we confront the so-called probabilistic version of the problem of evil. Now, according to this version of the problem, the coexistence of God and evil is logically possible, all right, but nevertheless, it's highly improbable. The extent and the depth of evil in the world is so great that it is improbable that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting this evil to occur. Therefore, given the evil in the world, it is improbable that God exists. Now, this is a much more powerful version of the argument, and therefore I want to spend the bulk of our time this morning on it. In response to this version of the problem of evil, I want to make three main points. Number one, we're simply not in a good position to assess the probability of whether God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils that occur. You see, as finite persons, we are limited in time, in space, in intelligence, in insight. But the transcendent and sovereign God sees the end of history from the beginning, and he providentially orders history so that his purposes are ultimately achieved through the free decisions of creatures. Now, in order to achieve his ends, God might have to put up with certain evils along the way which humans freely perpetrate, or which are necessary conditions for the existence of human freedom. Evils which appear pointless to us within our limited framework might be seen to have been justly permitted within God's wider framework. Let me give you an illustration from a recent field of science, chaos theory. In chaos theory, scientists have discovered that certain macroscopic systems are radically unstable to the smallest perturbations. So, for example, the flutter of a butterfly's wings in West Africa can set in motion forces which would eventually result in the occurrence of a hurricane over the Atlantic Ocean. And yet, no one looking at that little butterfly palpitating on a branch would ever be able to predict, even in principle, the outcome of that butterfly fluttering his wings. Now, in exactly the same way, certain evils in the world which appear pointless to us, such as, say, the brutal murder of an innocent man or a child's dying a terrible death of leukemia, could send a sort of ripple effect through history, so that God's morally sufficient reason for permitting it might not emerge until centuries later, or maybe in another country. When you think about God's providence over the whole of human history, then I think you can see how hopeless it is for us finite, limited observers to speculate on the probability of whether God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting any particular evil that we observe. We're frankly just not in a good position to assess these kinds of probabilities with any sort of confidence. Number two, the Christian faith entails certain doctrines which increase the probability of the coexistence of God and evil. In so doing, they decrease any improbability which evil would be thought to throw upon the existence of God. What are some of these doctrines? Well, let me just mention four. Number one, the chief purpose of life is not happiness, but rather the knowledge of God. I think that one reason that the problem of evil and suffering seems so intractable to people today is that we just naturally assume that if God exists, then his purpose for us human beings in life is happiness in this world. But according to the Christian view, that is false. The purpose of life is not happiness as such, but rather the knowledge of God. which in the end will produce ultimate and everlasting human fulfillment.